It's such a privilege to be together this morning and such a joy to be able to share God's word with us as a family. I know that our students are in the throes of exams and also final papers. And when do the matrics start their examinations, by the way? Tomorrow. Oh, very soon? Sorry? The 27th. Okay, they start. So it's literally around the corner. We pray God blesses you as you prepare for the time of reckoning. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? Time of giving an account of what you already know. Our lesson this morning, as you might have imagined, will deal with the idea of burden bearing. And I want us to maybe look at it a little bit differently this morning than what we have been looking at, but more from the idea that we come together every week before a burden-bearing God to be able to speak to Him about things that we are struggling with. I really love the way that the message of Eugene Peterson actually helps us to listen to it, read it a little bit differently. Jesus says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me and get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitted on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." What a lovely passage, just reading a different translation, that literally captures the essence of being able to walk with God. It's a passage that we often would refer to when people come to visit us and say to them, "Look, this is a place we want you to rest. We want you to understand that you are part of a family that loves God." But there's a reason why some people really struggle, and we especially. We come from a week where many of us are exhausted. We've been through very difficult, complex situations, our jobs, our calling to God, caring for our families, dealing with our children, and also the challenges that they are facing daily. With a car that breaks down, we deal with so much that really can be quite draining on us. We care for our parents as they are aging. We're dealing with health issues. We're also dealing with cleaning up and taking care of our community and cleaning up what God has blessed us with. But many years ago, I remember there was a time at the advent of computers where people were talking about just how much time we spend at work. And at that time, I remember there was a discussion with how much computers would reduce work time, and pretty much estimated that the average American family would be only, the American person that's working would only work for 22 hours a week. And then the question was flouted and asking, what will we do with all the rest of the time that we have? Well, you and I today, in the advent of computers and AI, know that that's not true. In fact, we find ourselves working harder than ever. When we look at this discussion that Jesus has with people, I want us not to lose the context of Jesus speaking about this coming to rest. First of all, Jesus Christ was speaking within a context of the religious elite of the time. First and foremost, he was speaking to us and saying, and probably in our life today, the Jews were tired of religion. We found that the leaders of the day would put heavy burdens on them, and so very much there were rules and regulations, specifically during the time of the Pharisees. They were so adept at making rules, and so when God would give 10 rules, they would add another 10 as to how those rules will be maintained, just to make sure that we got the rule right and the interpretation right. But eventually, like Jesus Christ would recognize in Matthew 23, verse 4, that ultimately it just became about the rules. And that is why he would decry it to the Pharisees and say to them, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. And so Jesus was not impressed with the way that they would handle people that were in love with God and wanted to honor him. You will find yourself carrying burdens too, but certainly following Christ is not one of them, where he would say, I want to add something more to your life. In fact, his response is saying that my burden is light. And in that comment, Jesus Christ wants to make it clear that following me is not something that's burdensome. It's not something that you really need to worry about too much. There's another emphasis that he wants us to look at. Daar's 'n tweede rede hoekom Jesus so geweldige probleem gehad het met die religious elite van daai tyd. In a book that was written by a guy called Kyle Idleman, the book is entitled Not a Fan. He speaks about us sometimes being a fan of Jesus Christ. And here again, he speaks of the idea that the closest we come to following Jesus Christ is pretty much being an adherent of Jesus. We follow him in as much as we can raise the banner for him and be the cheerleader. And so we imagine ourselves on a stadium where Jesus Christ is performing before everybody and we are cheering for him. But there is something that Kyle Idleman points out. He says, fans grow tired of maintaining an outer appearance that doesn't match an inner passion. And then it begs the question, what is your inner passion specifically related to Jesus Christ? In other words, let me ask you, what is the internal mechanism that almost drives you and makes you come alive? There's a concept spoken about by two researchers. They talk about living a vitalized life, a life that is full of life and full of love, that is energized by the very Spirit of God. Andre Agassi, it's a wonderful story. He was one of the greatest tennis players between 1986 and 2006. And many of us who knew him knew that he was probably one of the best tennis players in the world. He turned professional at the age of 16 and won 8 Grand Slam titles in his 20 years career. But there's a sad side to this wonderful, illustrious career of his. In his autobiography called Open, he revealed a secret which he only revealed later on, not while he was doing his preparation to stardom. He writes a book and said, my dad decided before I was born that I would be a number one player in the world. He said, I never chose that life. He put in hours and hours of practice. He battled for championships. He was good at what he did. In fact, in 1995, he became the world's number one tennis player, just as his father wanted him to be. But he never enjoyed it. He never really wanted to do that. He never chose that. It never was his to celebrate. In fact, there's a story that he had no love, no passion. And because he had to work hard at it, tennis became a burden rather than an absolute joy to be a part of. You see, sometimes that's exactly what happens in the life of the Christian. Sometimes we are living vicariously the life that our parents want for us, or that our mom or our dad or even our grandparents want for us to be this great star player. But inside we have something else in mind. And so we find that in the life of this young man, although he was good at what he did through practice and physical exertion and discipline, it was not really where his heartbeat was. What makes me sad about this, and it speaks a lot about Christians, sometimes we excel in our fields. We have our religion down pat. We know the songs down pat, but there's no love. There's no passion for God, and religion is always a burden. The idea of coming to worship is something that we do, something that we tick off our list, and something that we are a part of, for after all, we are Christians. But you see, if that is how Jesus wanted it to be, then religion becomes a burden. You see, at that time we found out that there are two kinds of people that Jesus would address. Jesus Christ dealt with the Pharisees as well as the Sadducees. And it's quite interesting that these two groups of people fulfilled the central roles of the religious elite. They were the chief priests and the elders. Now, I want you to know something about we told you about the Pharisees. There's something about the Sadducee. To become a Sadducee, you have to be born into the right family. There were other requirements, but you had to be part of that heritage. In other words, you cannot become a Sadducee just because you desire to be a Sadducee. You had to be born into the right family. And so it was to do with lineage, it has to do with heritage. And so sometimes with us, we are Christians because I'm born into Christianity. And that is why I am a Christian. My parents were Christian, my grandparents were Christian. However, there's another group which Jesus addresses, the Pharisee. This Pharisee came from a group of people within Judaism where it doesn't really matter whether you were born a Pharisee or a Sadducee. But you can become a Pharisee. And a Pharisaic person or Pharisee was somebody who becomes a Pharisee because of the inordinate amount of knowledge that they've accumulated through theological training. And so, in other words, these two categories of people typically would speak to the hearts of us as Christians. Some of us were born, some of us became. And here's the biggest danger that Jesus talks about. He says that sometimes we follow Jesus to honor our heritage. Sometimes we follow Jesus because we have intellectual knowledge and goals and rules and regulations that drives us. Both of these specific groups would be in danger of being exhausted by religion. And so Jesus walks into the fray of this exhaustion and he says, I will give you rest. In other words, he would speak across the grain and say, this is not the way that my Father intended it to be. He did not intend to add burdens to the lives of people. In fact, he wanted to come in to give us freedom, but freedom that is differently shaped so that you and I can live a vitalized life. And that is why he says, come to me all who labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. It's quite interesting to find out that sometimes when we talk about labor, we often have this idea of hard work, but that's not really what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the idea of exhaustion. Die Afrikaanse woord is jy's uitgeput, jy's uitgemergel. Jy's so op daai stadium wat daar niks meer is om af te sny en niks meer is om uit te haal nie. In Luke chapter 5 verse 5, this word is used very well where he says, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. Hours and hours of hard work out at sea and nothing to show for it. And you see, it's amidst this kind of feelings of exhaustion and saying that, my faith is really under a lot of pressure that Jesus walks into the lives and he says to you, I want you to understand that I want you to come to me. Rest is the most important promise of God. He speaks of it in the context of Israel going into Canaan after 40 years of traveling in the wilderness, being harassed from every single side of their lives, being in an environment where they were hostile enemies, were always ready to destroy them. And this particular encouragement comes to you and I through the Hebrew writer. And he talks to us and he says, well, after passing of life, what waits for us? And Hebrews chapter 4 verse 9, he says, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. And the word that's used is Sabbath. Often the word Sabbath is misunderstood as being a day that is demarcated purely for religious observance. But Sabbath is just the word for rest. In other words, he's saying there is a rest for God's people. Revelation 14 verse 13, speaking of the blessings that are given within Christendom for those who are God's children, he said, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, that they may rest from their labors. Now, I think for many of us, the idea of rest is very different. We have this idea of the idea of resting is to be able to sit in front of the television with a big bowl of popcorn, remote in our hands, and being able to surf the channels, have a look at our favorite series, and just chill. But heaven is probably going to be a different idea of rest. An idea of rest where we will be in the presence of God. There will be activity. It'll be very different to what we know here. And sometimes it helps us just to pull back from our worldly perspective on these things. You see, the idea of rest is also the idea of bearing one another's burdens, Galatians 6:2. In other words, we find today the unenviable task of having to look at a young girl that passed away at the age of 19. While the service was on and we were just in handing out the elements, I listened to a voice note that came from Abigail, Colsom's mom. She made the following comment. She said, Dereck, ons het nie verwag dat ons kind so gou sou sterf nie. And here's the key, is that this child has passed away suddenly. And she says, ons het nie eens die geld om daai kind te begrawe nie. And you see, brethren, remember what we spoke about this morning, that we don't even have the money to pay for the child's burial. And they need help. And that's what he talks about in terms of bearing one another's burdens. Being able to, in a small way, to help people be able to overcome the things that comes on their lives suddenly. You see, brethren, Jesus Christ steps into our life in the same way. And he says to you, whatever your burden is, and it might be loneliness at the moment, it might be sick relative, disappointment, rejection, or even addictions that's holding you back, things of disappointment and deep bitterness in your heart. He says to you, you and I need to talk about these things, because those addictions are going to kill you. Those resentments and wrath is going to destroy you. And it's interesting to note that when he speaks about these things, it echoes the Old Testament in Psalms chapter 55 and verse 22, where it said, cast your burdens on the Lord and he will sustain you. It's an interesting phrase in the Hebrew, because what he's saying is, I want you to pass your burden onto me and I will keep you afloat. I will make sure that you'll be able to carry your load. I'll make sure that you'll be able to be sustainable. You see, brethren, ultimately the God that has created you and I has never walked away from us and left us as orphans. He recognizes each one of our burdens. He recognizes each one of our pains, our hopes and our dreams, which maybe no one else knows about. Dashed hopes, dashed disappointments, betrayals. Let me give another illustration. Sue and I have been blessed to visit our daughter, son-in-law, and our grandchildren. And what a wonderful joy it is to visit with them. But what happens is that when we are about to leave, not probably when we're about to leave, there's long phone calls and long lists that are drawn up. Because now we are talking about South African spices, chocolates, chips. Because apparently, and I'm not quite sure if you're familiar with it, Americans can't make chocolate. That's just a fact. Sorry, my brother Scott, I love you, but they don't know how to do it. Cadbury's is the thing. Anyway, but do you understand what I'm saying? And here again, it's the idea of familiarity, isn't it? It's what I'm familiar with, what my palate recognizes. It's so good to taste home again. And so in the cases goes chocolates, cake. What's the other thing's name? Crunchy. That's the one. Then also there's a good friend of ours, Dr. Bill Bajans. He wants Simba chips, the chutney flavor. And that's what he wants. And so that goes into the bag. But I want you to see that we lug it across and we carry it through all these checkpoints. But it's not really a burden, is it? Because attached to this idea is the joy of them enjoying this wonderful blessing of being able to sit with spices on Ruan's food. And it just smells like home when they make dinner. And so this unbelievable idea of carrying and lugging all these things really gets reduced. But you see, brethren, Jesus still says to us that once that is loaded off, joy comes, and it's not a burden anymore. Jesus also says, my burden is light. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Matthew 11:30. And it sounds nice, brethren, because sometimes we look at the responsibilities of being a Christian. We take the responsibility seriously of being able to commit to be a part of a community of faith. But sometimes we see that the burdens of God is burdensome because there are rules and regulations. There are things that we need to stay away from, things that we need to do. But Jesus steps in very quickly, almost preempting that this would be the response. And so he almost addresses the very source of this frustration in Luke 11:46. And he says, woe to you also lawyers, for you load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourself do not touch the burdens with any of your fingers. In other words, he's saying, don't try to be smart with me. And Jesus was a man who cut to the heart of the source of these problems. He says, it's because of you. You are the guy that really makes these people's lives complicated. I want to speak of something, and I hope I'm not going to bore you with this detail. A little while ago, I've been studying for another reason, and inside of the idea of the Shema, it's a wonderful passage in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, where we find that even Jesus uses the same word in Matthew chapter 19, when he makes this idea and says that it was God who made them one. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, he speaks of this idea of being one, God being one. I want you to know that a cognate of the Hebrew word is exactly what is spoken of here. The idea of we being yoked together with God through the covenant of Christ. You see, there's much more attached to the idea of the Lord's Supper. I love the way Mark went into some of the depth, that idea that God constantly had to knock on the hearts of people to say, you've got to come back, man. But the idea of walking in covenant relationship with God is being yoked in with God. It's being yoked in with him under his direction. When you talk about a yoke, somehow in our modern age, the metaphor is lost. But I want you to see the idea that it's more of a training that we're undergoing. I think I might have mentioned this to you many years ago. At the age of 12, I was on the farm with my oompie Jan. And on the farm, we were sitting on the stoep, and I watched this guy coming with two donkeys in his horse. One was very small, a little black donkey, and the other one was gray. And these two donkeys were pulling a cart. And as they rode past, I became very incensed as a young boy. And I said, why would they have this little donkey running next to this, pulling this big cart? And my uncle said to me as he came past, he says, I want you to watch that the smaller donkey, the reins or the tethers around him is not really tied very tight. In other words, the biggest strain is taken by the larger donkey. And so while this little donkey is running so proudly because he's now running with the bigger donkey and he's pulling his bit, but that's all he could pull. But meanwhile, he was in training because one day he will then take the bigger load. So too with Jesus, if I think back. When I think back of it, it was a metaphor that I had to see because now I understand who Jesus is. He says, I want you to be yoked with me. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, you are looking great and you're looking fresh, and I will take your burden. I will take the strain. But you're in training, and I will be with you. You see, Jesus Christ speaks and asks a question for us. What makes this burden easy? Firstly, the greater love for our God lightens our burden. 1 John 5:3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. There's a direct correlation between our love for God and the fact that we know that His burdens are not, His commands are not burdensome. In fact, in the Old Testament, they speak of the way of the wicked is burdensome, and it is a tough road. And that is why when He talks to you and I, He says, I want you to know that whatever I ask of you, it's not to complicate your life. Allow me to use Sue as an example. There are things that she cannot do for herself. There's things that I cannot do for myself anymore. For example, getting up and making coffee is Susan's job. Because, sorry. But the idea is that there are things that, because of our relationship, we become in tuned and attuned to one another. So the idea is no problem, I'll pick it up for you. Or on my way home or on her way home, she'll call and say, by the way, what can I get for you on my way home? Is there something that you need? You see, brethren, when you do something out of love, it's not a burden. It's a joy. It's not a problem putting out the rubbish early on a Monday morning, which Susan gets up and puts it out. I almost said that I do that, but she does that. Now, please, I don't need criticism now. I'm a very sensitive guy. Because at 7 o'clock in the morning, we've got a guy that lives on the corner there in the area, and he makes a note and he says, well, the rubbish truck is here. And at that time, I, as a wonderful husband, will say, babe, the truck is almost here. And she'll be out there getting the rubbish bin to the side of the road. Again, love compels us to do those beautiful things. Scott, I think we need to talk about training again. Anyway, here's the other comment I want to make. The greater our commitment, the lighter the burden. And here, brethren, I want to just say to you is that if you consider yourself the most spiritual person within your relationships, God expects you to carry the higher load. You know, brethren, it's that God has got control over your life. He's taking the greatest strain in your life. And therefore, when we look at people that are struggling, we walk and we say, you know what? I will absolutely help you in this event. I want to just speak of a few things and then we can close for this morning. Let's go to the spiritual realm. I've got to be careful when we look at our walk with God that there are certain things that we must be careful not to do. Certain things that we must be careful not to say. Because words and actions have consequences. But if you think very deeply about those, it's not a burdensome decision. It's a wise decision because the outcomes can be so different. And therefore, in Hebrews 5, verse 14, he would speak to us as Christians that love God, that has got a long walk with God, and say, solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish between good and evil. In other words, initially it becomes tough to make that decision and evaluate and ask the hard question, should I not? And now with time, knowing experientially that it is the best decision to make. A lifetime of commitment helps us to walk closer to God. Why do we think that this discipline counts so much for us who are children of God? Why is that so important? In other words, when we ask the question as we walk with Jesus, why is discipline so important? You see, it's something called muscle memory. I watched a wonderful story, and I'll probably use it at some other time again. A guy by the name of Simon Sinek made a comment, and he said that the military, the Navy, and I think it was all the armed forces came to some big school, and they said to them that I want you to look at what we have to offer for you. So the Navy guy got up, did a PowerPoint display, and he said, look, being in the Navy, you will see places you've never seen before. You'll be in countries that you've never ever visited, and you will never be able to visit on your own. And you will enjoy these places. And so too did the Army, and so too did the Air Force. And finally, there was this guy who was a Marine. And he got up and he said to them, I want to warn you that when you become a Marine, every aspect of your life will be tested. Every aspect of your life will be ground. He said, here we will make sure that muscle memory is inculcated within every fiber of your being, so that at short command, you'll be able to survive the most difficult environments that you're going to enter into. We will take you past the idea of being tired. We'll take you past the idea of being sleepless for 3 to 4 days. We will take you past the idea of being hungry and thirsty. You will be tested in every way, shape, and form. If that's what you want, meet me at the back of the building and follow me. Isn't that what Jesus sometimes says to us? You see, sometimes we want to bring this nonsense and picture this wonderful picture of how great it is to follow Christ. But there is a process that requires discipline. To say yes to something and no to other things. You see, the idea of building in muscle memory is a process that does not start when you have your temptation. In Genesis 39, we know that Potiphar's wife tempted Joseph. But Joseph had made up his mind a long time ago that it's an area where he will not go into. His commitment to God was that he will never defile his boss's wife or any other person's wife for that matter. And he will never dishonor God. In the same way, it takes a process of discipleship within us to be able to walk that road with God, that we just never go there. In that essence, Paul would say that the life of a Christian is marked by, for me to live is Christ. Philippians 1:21. Galatians 2:20, I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives within me. That particular person was trying to tell people that the idea of instant gratification is a fool's paradise. God has never hidden his will within fine print, but he's told you that when you take up his burden, it is light and it's easy. And you will discover when you look at the lives of folk who have decided not to follow Jesus, that their lives are decidedly more complex, more difficult, and more eventful, sometimes more destructive. And that is why he calls us to a deep sense of spirituality, a livening of our environment, controlling of our senses, training of our being as we walk with God. And that is why he would say to you and I in Psalms 38, for my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. And that's the burden that Christ wants to help you and I with. Don't walk with these things. You know, brethren, I almost want to say this. You've not been designed for that. You've not been designed by God, being created in his image, to walk around with that kind of stuff in your life, holding you down for the rest of your life and asking the question, when can I see the light? The light is in Jesus Christ. And that is why the words of him is still clear. Come to me, all of you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This morning, I just want to encourage you, if you're struggling this morning, and you're often wondering and saying, man, you know, I'm really battling with this. There's another thing you need to take consideration of. You must be prepared to let that stuff go. Firstly, there's certain things in your life that is just not worth holding on to. There's certain things in your life that you've got no need to be loyal to, even sin. Let it go. Walk away from it. Here's the key. When you say yes to Jesus, you're going to say no to a lot of things. But I kid you not, in the long run, it's going to be worth it. I want you to speak to older brethren. that has had a long walk with God, and they will tell you, my dear friend, if it wasn't for Jesus and I carried on that path, who knows where my life would have been. But thank God for Jesus, who came across my path at the right time so that I can have a life in this life that is remarkably different from what this world would ever be able to even try to paint a picture that is beyond realistic, under promises and under delivers. Let's stand and sing a song of encouragement.